I had just signed the deed to my dream mountain cabin in North Carolina when my phone rang. Charlotte's voice was as demanding as ever. "Perfect timing, Mom. I'm moving in with you. Keep my room ready and stock the fridge with organic food. You know I can't eat that supermarket garbage." At 52, after decades of working double shifts as a pediatric nurse to support my entitled 25-year-old daughter, I simply smiled and said, "We'll see, sweetheart." What Charlotte didn't know was that I'd been planning this moment for months. The cabin wasn't my new home. It was bait. My real new life was waiting in a small apartment downtown, complete with a promotion I'd accepted in secret, and a gentle bookstore owner named David who'd been teaching me that love didn't require endless sacrifice. For years, I'd rescued Charlotte from every consequence, every failure, every uncomfortable emotion. Her father had abandoned us when she was 12, leaving me to raise her alone while she learned that Mom would always fix everything. But I was dying inside, disappearing piece by piece under the weight of her constant needs. The mountain cabin was my carefully orchestrated lie, a way to force her into independence while I finally claimed my own life. I'd already rented it to the Henderson family, complete with 2 young children who would be moving in the exact day Charlotte expected to find her devoted mother, waiting with fresh sheets and home-cooked meals. When she arrived at our cabin and found strangers unloading their furniture, Charlotte called me in a panic. "Mom, there are people living in your house. What's going on?" "They live there now," I said calmly from my real home 60 miles away. "I rented it to them." What followed was the most brutal conversation of our lives. Charlotte drove straight to my secret apartment, finding me surrounded by pottery I'd been learning to make, watercolor paintings of the mountains, and evidence of a life she'd never bothered to notice I was building. For the first time in 13 years, I refused to rescue her. "You've abandoned me," she screamed through tears. "I'm your daughter." "I'm not abandoning you," I replied, my heart breaking even as I held firm. "I'm teaching you to save yourself." The next 6 months would test everything I believed about motherhood, love, and the courage it takes to disappoint someone in order to help them grow. Charlotte would have to find her own apartment, her own job, her own strength, while I discovered who Eleanor was when she wasn't just Charlotte's mom. Some nights I lay awake wondering if I'd destroyed our relationship forever. Other nights I watched the sunrise over the French Broad River and felt free for the first time in decades. The question that haunted me was simple. Had I finally learned the difference between loving someone and enabling them to remain weak? Or had I become the kind of selfish mother I'd always sworn I'd never be? The answer would come when Charlotte finally understood that the cruelest thing I could have done was continue rescuing her from a life she needed to learn to live herself. But first, she'd have to forgive me for loving her enough to let her fall. In this story of boundaries, independence, and the radical act of a middle-aged woman choosing herself, the greatest plot twist isn't what I did to my daughter. It's what I finally did for both of us. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be endlessly helpful. Sometimes saving someone means teaching them to save themselves. And sometimes the only way to truly love your child is to stop sacrificing yourself completely for their comfort. This is the story of how I learned to love my daughter by learning to love myself, and how she learned to respect me by learning to stand on her own feet. I stared at my signature on the deed, the ink still wet and gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the real estate office in downtown Asheville. Eleanor Margaret Hartwell. My full name looked so official, so final, sprawled across the bottom of the document that made me the owner of a cedar cabin perched on Sunset Ridge. At 52, this was the first piece of property I'd ever bought entirely for myself. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hartwell," said Janet Morrison, the realtor who'd been showing me properties for the past 6 months. Her smile was genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and made the fine lines around them crinkle. "You picked a real gem. That view of the Blue Ridge is going to be spectacular come fall." I nodded, but my hands were already reaching for my phone as it buzzed insistently against the mahogany table. Charlotte's name flashed across the screen, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the involuntary response I'd developed over the years whenever my daughter called. It was never just to chat. "Mom?" Her voice carried that particular tone I knew so well, the one that mixed entitlement with just enough sweetness to make refusal feel cruel. "I heard you bought a place in the mountains. That's perfect timing." I stepped away from Janet's desk, moving toward the large windows that faced Pack Square. Below, tourists wandered between the art galleries and craft breweries that had transformed downtown Asheville into something unrecognizable from the sleepy mountain town I'd discovered during nursing school 30 years ago. Perfect timing for what, sweetheart? I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Charlotte had a gift for turning my victories into her opportunities. Well, I'm done with Atlanta. The dating scene is terrible, and my roommate is moving in with her boyfriend. I figured I could come stay with you for a while, get my head together, maybe try some freelance graphic design work. She paused, and I could almost see her twisting a strand of her honey blonde hair around her finger, the same gesture she'd used to charm her way out of trouble since she was 5. It'll be like a retreat. You can keep my room ready and maybe stock up on that organic stuff from Whole Foods. You know I can't eat regular supermarket food. I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Through the window, I watched a young mother pushing a stroller, her toddler running ahead to collect fallen leaves. The scene should have been peaceful, but all I could think about was the countless times I'd enabled Charlotte's pattern of retreat whenever life became challenging. Actually, honey, I'm not sure that's going to work out, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. What do you mean? Mom, I need this. I'm going through a really hard time right now, and you're my family. Isn't this what family does? There it was, the guilt, delivered with surgical precision. Charlotte had perfected this technique over the years, and I'd fallen for it every time. When she dropped out of college during her junior year because her boyfriend broke up with her. When she quit her first real job because her boss didn't appreciate her creativity. When she moved back home for 6 months after her engagement fell apart, eating my food and using my car while I worked extra shifts to support us both. I understand you're going through a difficult time, I said, watching Janet pretend not to listen while she organized papers. But I bought this place for myself, Charlotte. I need some time to figure out what I want. Figure out what you want? Her voice pitched higher, incredulous. Mom, you're 52. Haven't you already figured that out? The question hit harder than she'd intended, I'm sure, but it crystallized something that had been building in me for months. When exactly had I stopped being Eleanor and become simply Charlotte's mom, or the reliable nurse who always picks up extra shifts? When had my dreams shrunk to fit the spaces between everyone else's needs? I'm still figuring it out, I said quietly. And that's exactly why I need this time. Fine. Charlotte's voice turned cold, the way it always did when she didn't get what she wanted immediately. But I'm driving up there next weekend. We'll talk about this in person. The line went dead, and I stared at the phone for a moment before sliding it back into my purse. Janet was studying me with the kind of professional concern that real estate agents probably learned in training. Everything okay? She asked. It will be, I said, and for the first time in years, I actually believed it. The drive up to Sunset Ridge took 25 minutes from downtown Asheville, winding through forests that were just beginning to hint at their autumn transformation. I'd made this drive dozens of times over the past months, first as a prospective buyer, then as someone learning to see herself as worthy of something beautiful. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by towering pines and wild rhododendrons. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that opened onto a wraparound porch. But every window framed a view that took my breath away, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I'd discovered this place during one of my weekend escapes from Charlotte. 3 months ago, she'd been going through another crisis, this time involving a job she'd quit without notice because her supervisor had asked her to actually show up on time. I'd been driving aimlessly through the mountains trying to clear my head when I'd spotted the for sale sign barely visible through the overgrown driveway. Janet had warned me that the cabin needed work. The previous owners, an elderly couple from Florida, had used it only sporadically and hadn't maintained it well. But I'd fallen in love with the potential, with the way the afternoon light slanted through the living room windows, and the way the porch wrapped around the entire structure like a gentle embrace. Now, standing on that porch with the deed in my purse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the pure, uncomplicated joy of ownership. Not shared ownership, not temporary guardianship, not responsibility for someone else's dreams. This was mine. My phone rang again, and I almost ignored it until I saw David's name on the screen. How did it go? His voice was warm, unhurried in the way that had first attracted me to him 6 months ago when I'd wandered into his bookstore looking for something to read during Charlotte's latest drama. I'm officially a property owner, I said, settling into one of the rocking chairs the previous owners had left behind. And Charlotte has already informed me that she's moving in. David's chuckle was soft but understanding. He'd been through something similar with his own adult son after his wife died, though Marcus had eventually found his footing and now managed a successful restaurant in Brevard. Are you going to tell her? He asked. Tell her what? About your real plan. About the apartment downtown. About us. I watched a red-winged blackbird land on the porch railing, its scarlet patches brilliant against the weathered wood. "Not yet," I said. "I think she needs to learn some things first." The plan had been forming in my mind for months, crystallizing during my conversations with David and my twice-weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Chen in downtown Asheville. I'd been seeing Dr. Chen since Charlotte's last major crisis, when I'd finally admitted that I might be part of the problem. "You're enabling her," Dr. Chen had said during our third session, her voice gentle but direct. "Every time you rescue Charlotte from the consequences of her choices, you rob her of the opportunity to grow." "But she's my daughter," I'd protested. "Isn't helping her what mothers do?" "Helping, yes. But there's a difference between helping someone grow and helping someone avoid growing." That conversation had planted the seed that grew into this moment. The cabin would be my decoy, a way to force Charlotte into independence while I finally claimed a life of my own. I'd already put a deposit down on a one-bedroom apartment in the River Arts District, walking distance from Mission Hospital, where I'd accepted a promotion to charge nurse in the pediatric ICU. The apartment was small but perfect, with hardwood floors and windows that faced the French Broad River. "She's going to be furious when she finds out," David said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. He was probably doing inventory in the rare book section, his favorite quiet task for Sunday afternoons. "Probably," I agreed. "But maybe that's what she needs. Maybe we both need that." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the cabin, making mental lists of the work it would need. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily, the back bedroom window stuck when I tried to open it, and several of the porch boards creaked ominously under my weight. But these felt like solvable problems, the kind of challenges I could tackle without worrying about someone else's feelings or needs. I'd grown up in a house where my father fixed everything himself, where resourcefulness was valued more than convenience. After he died when I was in nursing school, my mother had sold the house and moved into a retirement community, but she'd passed down his toolbox along with his philosophy that anything worth having was worth working for. Charlotte had never learned that lesson. Her father, Michael, had been the kind of man who threw money at problems instead of teaching anyone how to solve them. When he left us, disappeared one morning with a note about finding himself and a forwarded address for his attorney, he'd taken that easy money mentality with him, but left Charlotte expecting the world to continue providing solutions without effort. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made myself a cup of tea using the cabin's ancient coffee maker and sat on the porch to watch the light change. This was something I'd never allowed myself before. Just sitting, just being, without a mental list of everyone else's needs crowding my thoughts. My phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Driving up Friday afternoon. Make sure there are fresh sheets on my bed and some of that herbal tea I like. Love you, Mom." I read the message twice, then set the phone aside without responding. For the first time in 25 years, I was going to let my daughter's expectations go unmet. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. The kind of love that trusted her enough to believe she could handle disappointment and grow from it. The mountains held their silence around me as darkness fell, and I found myself thinking about the woman I used to be before motherhood consumed my identity. Eleanor, who had wanted to travel, who had dreamed of opening her own clinic, who had written poetry in stolen moments between shifts. Somewhere along the way, that woman had been buried under the weight of responsibility and guilt, but maybe, just maybe, she was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. I locked the cabin door and walked to my car, already planning my next visit. Next weekend, when Charlotte arrived expecting to find her devoted mother waiting with open arms and a prepared bedroom, she would instead find the Hendersons, Mark, Jenny, and their 2 young children, moving into what she assumed was her sanctuary. The drive back to my temporary apartment in Charlotte felt different than usual, charged with possibility rather than weighed down by obligation. I had 6 days to prepare for the most important conversation of my daughter's life. 6 days to ready myself for the moment when I would finally choose my own happiness over her comfort. As I merged onto I-40, heading east toward Charlotte, I caught myself smiling in the rearview mirror. For the first time in decades, I was excited about what came next. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made the Blue Ridge Mountains look like they'd been painted with watercolors. I stood at the window of my new apartment in the River Arts District, watching the French Broad River flow past, while my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug I'd made in Wednesday night's pottery class. The apartment was small, just 800 square feet, but every inch of it was mine. I'd spent the week moving my real belongings here. The antique rocking chair my grandmother had left me, the collection of medical textbooks that had gotten me through nursing school, The photo albums that chronicled Charlotte's childhood, but also contained pictures of the woman I used to be before motherhood consumed everything. For the first time in decades, I'd arranged furniture to please myself rather than accommodate someone else's needs. David had helped me hang my watercolor paintings yesterday evening. They weren't museum quality, but they captured something I'd been trying to express. The way morning light fell across the mountains. The sense of space and possibility that had been missing from my life for so long. He'd stood back to admire one particular painting of Sunset Ridge at dawn, his gray hair catching the light from the window. "You're really doing this," he'd said. Not a question, but a statement of quiet admiration. "I'm terrified," I'd admitted, leaning into his solid warmth. "Good," he'd replied. "The best decisions usually are terrifying." Now, as I watched the clock inch toward 2 o'clock, Charlotte's estimated arrival time, I felt that terror mixing with something else. Anticipation. Not the dread-filled anticipation I'd grown accustomed to when dealing with my daughter's crises, but something cleaner, more purposeful. I was about to free us both, even if she couldn't see it that way yet. My phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m. Charlotte's ringtone, a snippet of Material Girl she'd chosen ironically, but that had proven more prophetic than amusing, filled the small apartment. "Mom?" Her voice was high and tight with panic. "Mom, what the hell is going on? There are people here, strangers. They're moving furniture into your house." I set down my mug carefully, buying myself a moment to breathe. Through the window, I could see a great blue heron standing motionless in the shallows of the river, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to strike. "Hello, Charlotte. How was your drive?" "How was my—" "Mom, are you listening to me? There are people in your house. A whole family. They have kids and they're acting like they live here." "They do live there," I said simply. "I rented it to them." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Charlotte's voice came back, smaller and more confused than I'd heard it in years. "You rented it? But I was coming to stay with you. We talked about this. I told you I needed this." "No, sweetheart. You told me you were taking this. There's a difference." I could hear her breathing, could picture her standing in the gravel driveway of the cabin, probably wearing one of those oversized sweaters she favored and the designer jeans I'd helped her pay for last Christmas. The image made my heart ache, but I held firm. "Where are you?" she asked finally. "I'm at home." "What do you mean at home? That place was supposed to be home. For you, maybe. Not for me." Another long pause, then the sound of her car door slamming. The engine started, and I knew she was coming to find me. I'd expected this, had even left my address on the counter at the cabin along with a note explaining that the Hendersons were the new renters and should be treated with courtesy. "I'm coming to Charlotte," she said. "We're going to figure this out." "I'm not in Charlotte anymore, honey." "What do you mean you're not? Mom, what is happening? You're scaring me." For the first time since this conversation began, her voice cracked with genuine vulnerability rather than manipulative panic. It nearly broke my resolve. 25 years of maternal instinct screamed at me to fix this, to make it better, to sacrifice my own needs for her comfort. "I'll text you my address," I said instead. "Drive carefully." I hung up before she could respond, then sent her the address of my apartment. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed, but my resolve remained steady. Dr. Chen had warned me about this moment, had helped me prepare for the guilt and the urge to backtrack. We'd role-played different scenarios, including the one where Charlotte would use tears and vulnerability as weapons. "Remember," Dr. Chen had said during our last session, "feeling guilty about setting boundaries doesn't mean the boundaries are wrong. It means you're human, and you're breaking a pattern that's been years in the making." I spent the next hour tidying the apartment, not frantically, the way I used to clean before Charlotte's visits, but methodically, creating a space that reflected who I was becoming rather than who she expected me to be. I arranged some fresh flowers David had brought me in a vase on the kitchen counter, opened the windows to let in the sound of the river, and put on a pot of coffee. At 4:15, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She'd always taken them 2 at a time, even as a child, but today her steps were slower, more hesitant. When the knock came at my door, it was soft rather than demanding. I opened the door to find Charlotte looking exactly as I'd pictured her, but smaller somehow. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her green eyes, so much like her father's, were red-rimmed from crying. She was carrying a large duffel bag and a designer purse I'd helped her buy for a job interview she'd never followed through on. "Mom?" She looked past me into the apartment, taking in the unfamiliar furniture, the paintings on the walls, the evidence of a life she knew nothing about. "What is this place?" "This is where I live now. Come in." She stepped inside cautiously, like someone entering a stranger's home. I watched her eyes move from the river view to the bookshelves lined with titles she'd never seen, to the pottery wheel I'd set up in the corner near the window. "You do pottery?" she asked, touching one of my beginner pieces, a slightly lopsided bowl I'd been particularly proud of. "I'm learning. Coffee?" She nodded, settling onto my small couch with the careful movements of someone trying to process too much information at once. I poured 2 mugs and joined her, leaving space between us that felt both protective and necessary. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You bought a house in the mountains, and I was going to come stay with you, and now you're living in this tiny apartment and there are strangers in your house and nothing makes sense." "The mountain house was never meant for me to live in," I said. "I bought it as an investment property. The Hendersons are my tenants." "But you let me think. You let me plan." Her voice was rising again, the familiar anger replacing confusion. "I didn't let you do anything, Charlotte. You assumed. You announced your plans without asking if they worked for me, just like you always do." She stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. "Just like I always do?" "Mom, I'm your daughter. I thought you wanted to help me. I do want to help you. But there's a difference between helping you and enabling you to avoid growing up." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unspoken resentment and love and frustration. Charlotte set down her coffee mug with shaking hands. "Enabling me? Is that what you think you've been doing?" "Isn't it?" I asked gently. "When was the last time you faced the consequences of a decision without me stepping in to cushion the landing?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, perhaps for the first time considering our relationship from my perspective. But then her face hardened, and she stood up abruptly. "So this is what? Some kind of lesson? Some kind of punishment?" "It's not a punishment, sweetheart. It's a boundary." "A boundary?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, I'm 25 years old and I just lost my job and my living situation fell through, and the one person who's supposed to support me unconditionally is talking about boundaries?" "Yes," I said simply, "because I love you too much to keep pretending that rescuing you from every difficulty is actually helping you." Charlotte began pacing the small living room, her movements sharp and agitated. "This is insane. You've lost your mind. Is this some kind of midlife crisis? Are you having an affair or something?" The question hit closer to the truth than she knew, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. David and I weren't having an affair. We'd been careful to keep our relationship appropriate given that I was technically still married, though Michael and I had been separated for over a year, and divorce papers were in process. But Charlotte's assumption revealed something important. She'd never considered that I might have a romantic life, desires of my own, needs that extended beyond motherhood. "This isn't about anyone else, Charlotte. It's about me finally admitting that the way we've been living isn't healthy for either of us." "Healthy?" She spun around to face me. "I'll tell you what's not healthy. Abandoning your daughter when she needs you most." "I'm not abandoning you. I'm here. I'm talking to you. I'm willing to help you figure out a sustainable plan for your life. But I'm not going to be your permanent safety net anymore." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and she sank back down onto the couch. "I don't understand how you can be so cruel. After everything we've been through together, after Dad left us, after all those years when it was just us against the world." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. She was right about those years. After Michael left, it had been just us. I'd worked double shifts to keep us afloat financially while trying to be both mother and father to a heartbroken 12-year-old. We'd developed a closeness born of shared trauma, but somewhere along the way, that closeness had become codependence. Those were hard years, I agreed. And yes, we had to depend on each other more than was probably ideal. But Charlotte, you're not 12 anymore. And I'm not the desperate single mother who thought her only value came from how much she could sacrifice for her child. So what? I'm supposed to just figure everything out on my own? What if I fail? Then you fail, and you get back up, and you try again, just like everyone else does. She stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "When did you become so hard?" The question pierced something deep in my chest. Hard. Is that what strength looked like to her? Is that what boundaries felt like when you'd never encountered them before? "I'm not hard, sweetheart. I'm just not limitless anymore." Charlotte was crying openly now, and every instinct I had screamed at me to comfort her, to take back everything I'd said, to return to our familiar dance of crisis and rescue. Instead, I reached for her hand. "I know this is scary," I said. "Change is always scary. But I have faith in you, Charlotte. More faith than you have in yourself." She pulled her hand away. "If you had faith in me, you wouldn't be doing this. If I didn't have faith in you, I would keep rescuing you until you were 40 and still calling me to solve your problems." We sat in silence for several minutes, the sound of the river filling the space between us. Finally, Charlotte spoke, her voice small and defeated. "So, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? Where do other people go when they need a fresh start?" I asked. "Other people have parents who help them. And I am helping you. I'm helping you learn to help yourself." She looked around the apartment again, and I could see her really taking it in for the first time. The evidence of my independence, the signs of a life that existed entirely separate from her needs. When her gaze landed on the pottery wheel, something shifted in her expression. "How long have you been living here?" she asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She repeated the words as if testing their weight. "You've been living here for 3 weeks and you didn't tell me." "I've been planning this for months, Charlotte. The apartment, the job promotion, all of it." "What job promotion?" "I'm the new charge nurse in pediatric ICU at Mission Hospital." Her eyebrows rose. "You always wanted to work in pediatric ICU." It surprised me that she remembered. When Charlotte was young, I used to talk about my dream of specializing in critical care for children. But as her needs became more demanding and my energy became more depleted, I'd stopped mentioning those kinds of aspirations. "Yes," I said. "I did. And you took it without telling me." "I took it without asking your permission," I corrected. "There's a difference." She stood up again, but this time her movements weren't agitated. She walked to the window and looked out at the river, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "I feel like I don't know you," she said finally. "Maybe you don't. Maybe I forgot who I was for a while too." She turned back to face me, and for a moment, I saw not the demanding young woman who'd been calling me for years, but the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares about her father never coming home. "Are you going to help me at all?" she asked. "With finding a place to stay, I mean? Or a job? Or anything?" "I'll help you make a plan," I said. "I'll help you research options. I'll even lend you some money to get started if you need it. But I won't solve it for you, and I won't let you move in here as a way to avoid solving it yourself." She was quiet for a long time, and I could almost see her cycling through the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. I wondered if acceptance would come, and how long it might take. "There's something else, isn't there?" she said suddenly. "Something you're not telling me." My heart jumped. Charlotte had always been perceptive, even when she was being selfish. "What makes you say that?" "You seem different. Happier, maybe. There's something." She studied my face with the intensity she usually reserved for social media. "Oh my God, there's someone, isn't there? You're seeing someone." I felt my cheeks flush again, and Charlotte's eyes widened. "Mom, you're seeing someone. Who is it? How long has this been going on?" For the first time since she'd arrived, she sounded like the daughter I remembered from before our relationship became transactional. Curious, excited, invested in my happiness rather than just my utility. "His name is David," I said carefully. "He owns a bookstore downtown. We've been getting to know each other." "Getting to know each other," she repeated with a slight smile. "Mom, are you being coy about dating?" Despite everything, I found myself smiling back. "Maybe a little. Is he nice? Is he cute? Does he treat you well?" The rapid-fire questions were so normal, so daughter-like, that I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "He's very nice. And yes, he treats me well. He's kind and patient, and he makes me laugh." "Good," Charlotte said firmly. "It's about time." The moment of connection was brief but precious, a reminder of what our relationship could be when it wasn't built on need and resentment. But then reality crept back in, and Charlotte's expression grew serious again. "Is that why you're doing this? Because of him?" "No," I said. "I'm doing this because I finally realized I was disappearing, Charlotte. And you can't love someone who doesn't exist." She absorbed this, turning back to the window. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant low across the water, turning everything gold and soft. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "I don't know how to be independent. You always made it look so hard." "It is hard sometimes, but it's also freedom. What if I mess everything up? Then you'll figure out how to unmess it up, and if you can't figure it out on your own, you'll ask for help. Real help, not rescue." Charlotte turned around, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked directly at me. Not through me, not past me to what I could provide, but at me. "I'm scared, Mom." "I know, sweetheart. I'm scared too. Will you help me make a list of things I need to do? Places I could look for a job, that kind of thing?" It was a small step, but it was a step toward partnership rather than dependence. "Of course I will." Charlotte sat back down on the couch, closer to me this time. "Can I stay here tonight? Just tonight? While I figure out what to do next?" Every fiber of my being wanted to say yes, to extend the deadline, to make this transition easier for both of us. But Dr. Chen's voice echoed in my mind. "The kindest thing you can do is trust her to handle this." "There's a nice hotel about 10 minutes from here," I said gently. "The Grove Park Inn. It's beautiful, and it'll give you time to think without either of us falling back into old patterns." Charlotte's face fell, but she nodded slowly. "You're really not going to cave on this, are you?" "No, sweetheart, I'm not." She picked up her duffel bag and slung it over her shoulder. "Will you have dinner with me tomorrow, so we can talk about that list? I'd like that very much." As she walked toward the door, Charlotte paused and looked back at me. "I'm angry with you. I want you to know that. I understand. But I'm also, I don't know, maybe a little proud of you? Which is weird and confusing, and I don't like it." I smiled. Change is weird and confusing, but it's not always bad. After she left, I sat in my small living room as darkness fell over the river. My phone rang twice. First Charlotte, asking for directions to the hotel, then David, wanting to know how things had gone. I told him about Charlotte's anger and her tears and her grudging admission that she might be proud of me. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Guilty, yes. Sad, definitely. But underneath those familiar emotions was something else. Relief, maybe. Or possibility. Free, I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel free. That night, I lay in my own bed in my own apartment, listening to the sound of the river and planning the conversation I would have with my daughter tomorrow. We would make lists and research options and begin the slow work of rebuilding our relationship on healthier ground. It would be difficult, and there would be setbacks, and Charlotte would probably hate me for a while. But as I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the woman in the watercolor painting hanging above my dresser. The one who stood alone on a mountain ridge, arms spread wide to embrace the dawn. For the first time in decades, I was beginning to understand who that woman might be. 6 months later, I stood at my kitchen window watching the March sun rise over the French Broad River, painting everything in soft pastels that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with watercolors. My coffee was still steaming in the ceramic mug I'd made during my intermediate pottery class, this one perfectly round and glazed in a deep blue that matched the pre-dawn sky. The apartment that had felt daringly small when I first moved in now felt exactly right. Every corner purposeful and mine. The months since that October confrontation with Charlotte had been a roller coaster of emotions, setbacks, small victories, and gradual healing. There had been weeks when she didn't speak to me at all, sending only terse text messages when absolutely necessary. There had been nights when I'd lain awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, if tough love was just cruelty dressed up in therapeutic language. But there had also been breakthrough moments that reminded me why I'd chosen this difficult path. November had been the darkest month. Charlotte had called me exactly twice. Once to inform me that she was fine and didn't need my help with anything, and once to ask if I could co-sign a lease for an apartment she couldn't afford. When I'd gently declined the co-signing, explaining that it would undermine the very independence I was trying to help her achieve, she'd hung up on me. For 3 weeks after that, I heard nothing. During that silence, I'd questioned everything. I'd sit in Dr. Chen's office, tears streaming down my face, wondering if I'd lost my daughter forever in the name of tough love. David had been endlessly patient, listening to me second-guess myself and offering quiet reassurance when I needed it most. But even his steady presence couldn't entirely quiet the voice in my head that whispered I was a selfish mother who'd abandoned her child when she needed me most. Change is rarely linear, Dr. Chen had reminded me during one particularly difficult session. Charlotte is grieving the relationship you used to have, just like you are. That's healthy and necessary, even when it's painful. But what if she never forgives me? I'd asked. Then you'll have to live with that possibility. But Eleanor, living with the possibility of her anger is still better than living with the certainty of both of your resentment if you'd continued the old pattern. The breakthrough had come in December, just 2 weeks before Christmas. Charlotte had called me from a Walmart parking lot, And for the first time in months, she hadn't sounded angry or distant. She'd sounded scared and exhausted. "Mom?" Her voice had been small, younger than her 25 years. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call." "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "My car broke down and I used all my money for the security deposit on this studio apartment, and I don't know how I'm going to get it fixed. The mechanic says it needs a new transmission, and that costs more than I make in 2 months." Every maternal instinct I possessed had screamed at me to rush to her rescue, to offer to pay for the repairs, to solve the problem as quickly as possible. Instead, I'd taken a deep breath and asked, "What do you think your options are?" There had been a long pause. I don't know. That's why I called you. I understand. But let's think through this together. What resources do you have available?" For the next 45 minutes, we'd brainstormed solutions. Public transportation routes to her job, car-sharing apps for emergencies, the possibility of finding a cheaper used car instead of fixing the expensive repairs on her current one, local mechanics who might be willing to work out a payment plan. I'd offered to research some of these options with her, but I hadn't offered to solve the problem for her. By the end of the call, Charlotte had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it would require some sacrifices and creative problem-solving, but it was her plan. More importantly, it was a plan she could execute and afford without my financial intervention. "Mom?" she'd said before hanging up. "Yes? Thank you for not just offering to fix it for me. I mean, part of me really wanted you to, but I think I needed to figure this out myself." "I think so too." That conversation had marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, Charlotte had started calling more regularly, but the nature of our calls had changed completely. Instead of crisis-driven demands for rescue, they became genuine check-ins. She'd tell me about her job search, her apartment hunting, her gradual adjustment to handling her own problems. I'd share updates about my work, my relationship with David, my pottery classes, and watercolor painting. By January, she'd found work at a nonprofit organization that provided services to at-risk youth. The pay wasn't much, but she'd sounded genuinely excited about the work in a way I'd never heard her talk about any job before. She'd found a tiny studio apartment in West Asheville that she could afford on her nonprofit salary, and she'd started attending a support group for adult children of divorce. Something she'd discovered on her own, without my suggestion or encouragement. The first time she'd invited me to see her new place, I'd been amazed by what I found. The apartment was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette that was smaller than my bathroom. But Charlotte had made it her own with carefully chosen secondhand furniture, plants she'd learned to care for, and photographs that reflected her interests, rather than just her social media presence. It was humble, but it was authentically hers in a way that nowhere she'd ever lived had been before. "I know it's not much," she'd said, watching my face carefully as I looked around. "It's perfect," I'd replied, and I'd meant it. It's exactly what someone starting out on their own should have. A place that's small enough to afford, but nice enough to be proud of. "I actually am proud of it," she'd admitted, sounding surprised by her own words. "I never thought I'd be proud of living somewhere this small, but I earned every square foot of this place." That day, we'd cooked dinner together in her tiny kitchen. Nothing fancy, just pasta and vegetables. But it had felt like the most significant meal we'd ever shared. For the first time in our relationship, Charlotte had been the hostess, offering me something from her own resources, rather than expecting me to provide everything. February had brought new challenges and new growth. Charlotte's car situation had resolved in an unexpected way. She'd decided to sell it and use the money to buy a decent bicycle and invest in good public transportation passes. Living without a car in Asheville required some creativity and planning, but she'd embraced the challenge with enthusiasm that surprised both of us. "It's actually kind of liberating," she'd told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "I'm not spending money on gas and insurance and repairs. I'm getting exercise every day, and I'm learning to plan ahead instead of just being impulsive about where I go and when." The young woman who had once demanded that I maintain a car for her use while she lived at home was now proudly independent on 2 wheels and public transit. The transformation was remarkable. But what struck me most was that she genuinely seemed happier. There was a confidence in her voice that hadn't been there before, a sense of genuine accomplishment that came from solving her own problems. We'd established a new tradition during these months, Sunday dinners at my apartment. Charlotte would arrive around 3 o'clock, usually carrying some ingredient she'd forgotten to pick up at the farmer's market, and we'd cook together. These meals had become the anchor of both our weeks, a time to connect without crisis, to enjoy each other's company without the weight of unresolved problems hanging over us. David had joined us a few times, tentatively at first, but Charlotte had gradually warmed to him. I'd watched with amazement as my daughter, who had previously seen any man in my life as competition for my attention, began to genuinely appreciate David for who he was, rather than resenting him for what he represented. She'd started asking his advice about books to read, and he'd begun recommending titles that might help her in her work with at-risk youth. Now, as I prepared for what would be our 18th Sunday dinner together, I reflected on how much had changed. My life had expanded in ways I'd never imagined possible. The promotion to charge nurse in pediatric ICU had challenged me professionally in the best possible way. I was working with critically ill children and their families, using skills I'd developed over decades, but in a setting that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. My relationship with David had deepened slowly and naturally. We'd moved in together just last month, not out of desperation or convenience, but because we'd both reached a place where sharing a life felt like the natural next step. He'd brought his extensive book collection and his gentle presence into my small apartment, somehow making it feel larger rather than more crowded. Charlotte had been the one to suggest we find a bigger place together. "Mom, you and David are practically living together anyway," she'd said during one of our Sunday dinners. "And honestly, it's weird watching you two try to maintain separate households when you're clearly committed to each other. Just get a proper place together and stop pretending you're not ready for that step." Her blessing on my relationship, freely given and genuinely meant, had been one of the most precious gifts I'd ever received. The daughter who had once viewed any romantic relationship of mine as a threat to her security was now actively encouraging my happiness. The knock on my door came right on time, but instead of Charlotte's usual confident rap, this was more tentative. When I opened the door, I found her standing in the hallway with a bouquet of daffodils and an expression I couldn't quite read. She looked different somehow, more settled, more at peace with herself. Her hair was shorter now, cut in a style that framed her face beautifully and made her look more mature. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, but there was something about the way she carried herself that suggested inner confidence, rather than external validation seeking. "Hi, Mom." She stepped into the apartment, and I noticed immediately that her movements had a different quality, less hurried, more purposeful. "These are from the farmer's market. I thought they'd look nice on your table." "They're beautiful," I said, accepting the flowers. "What's the occasion?" Charlotte settled onto one of my kitchen stools, and I could see she had something important on her mind. Over the months, I'd learned to read her moods more accurately, to distinguish between the times when she needed advice and the times when she just needed someone to listen. "I have some news," she said, her hands fidgeting slightly with the hem of her sweater. "Good news, I think, but I wanted to tell you in person, and I wanted to ask your opinion about something." I arranged the daffodils in a blue ceramic vase, one of my more successful pottery projects, and set them on the counter where the afternoon light would hit them. The simple act of arranging flowers in my own vase, in my own kitchen, still gave me a small thrill of ownership and independence. "I'm listening," I said, settling onto the stool beside her. The nonprofit got a major grant to expand their youth mentorship program, and they offered me the position of program coordinator. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "It's a full-time position with benefits, and I'd be working directly with kids who are transitioning out of the foster care system, helping them develop life skills and connect with community resources." I studied my daughter's face as she spoke, seeing not just the excitement about the job, but also something deeper, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her previous work experiences. This wasn't just another job to pay the bills. This was something she genuinely cared about. "Charlotte, that sounds incredible. Tell me more about what the position would involve." "Well, I'd be supervising a team of volunteer mentors who work one-on-one with kids aging out of foster care. These are teenagers and young adults who don't have family support systems, who are basically facing the same challenges I faced when you stopped rescuing me, except they don't have a safety net at all." The way she framed this, comparing her own journey to independence with the struggles of foster youth, showed me how much her perspective had matured. She was no longer seeing herself as the victim of my abandonment, but as someone who had learned valuable skills through facing challenges. "It sounds like your own experiences would make you uniquely qualified for this kind of work," I said. "That's what I'm hoping. I know what it feels like to be scared about being independent, to not know how to handle basic adult responsibilities. But I also know how good it feels to figure things out for yourself, to realize you're stronger than you thought you were." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I listened to her speak. This was the woman I'd hoped she could become. Someone who could transform her own struggles into strength that could help others, Someone who understood that independence wasn't abandonment, but empowerment. There's more, though, Charlotte continued. The position requires additional training and certification as a youth counselor. It would be intensive, nights and weekends for about 4 months, while I'm also working full-time. And I'd have to commit to staying with the organization for at least 2 years after completing the training. That sounds like a significant commitment. How do you feel about it? Honestly, terrified and excited in equal measure. She laughed, but it was the kind of nervous laughter that came from facing a real challenge rather than running from one. This is the first time I've ever been offered something that feels like it could be a career rather than just a job. But it's also the first time I've had to make a decision this big entirely on my own. I waited, sensing that she had more to say. Over the months, I'd learned the importance of giving her space to process her thoughts, rather than jumping in with immediate advice or reassurance. I keep thinking about what you said last October, about having faith in me. Do you remember that? I nodded. I remembered that conversation with painful clarity, the way Charlotte had looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language when I'd talked about boundaries and enabling. I didn't believe you then. I thought you were just making excuses for being selfish. But these past months, learning to handle things on my own, I've started to understand what you meant about faith. What do you understand now that you didn't then? Charlotte was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I understand that real love sometimes means believing in someone, even when they don't believe in themselves. And I understand that the reason you stopped rescuing me wasn't because you didn't love me enough. It was because you loved me too much to let me stay weak. The simple truth of her words hit me like a physical force. This was what I'd been hoping for but had never been sure she'd achieve. The understanding that boundaries weren't rejection but protection, that tough love was still love, just expressed differently. I also understand, she continued, that I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Back then, I would have taken this job offer to you and expected you to tell me what to do. I would have wanted you to analyze all the pros and cons and basically make the decision for me. And now? Now I know I can make this decision myself. I know what my goals are, I know what I'm capable of, and I know what I want my life to look like. But I also know that asking for input isn't the same thing as asking someone else to decide for me. This distinction between seeking consultation and demanding rescue was one of the most important things Charlotte had learned. It was the difference between healthy interdependence and codependent enabling. So you want my input, not my decision? Exactly. She smiled, and it was the first completely relaxed smile I'd seen from her in years. What do you think, Mom? Do you think I'm ready for this kind of responsibility? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. The young woman sitting in my kitchen bore little resemblance to the demanding, entitled person who'd stood in this same space 6 months ago. This Charlotte had earned her own apartment, held down a job she cared about, learned to handle disappointment and setbacks without falling apart. More importantly, she'd developed the kind of self-awareness that allowed her to recognize both her strengths and her areas for growth. I think, I said slowly, that you're exactly the kind of person these young people need. Someone who understands what it feels like to be scared of independence, but who also knows the satisfaction of earning your own strength. Someone who won't rescue them from their challenges, but will support them while they figure out how to handle those challenges themselves. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Do you really mean that? I've never meant anything more in my life. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of this conversation. Outside the window, the river flowed past with its usual steady rhythm, and I thought about how much water had passed by since that October day, when our relationship had fundamentally changed. There's something else I need to tell you, Charlotte said finally, something I should have said months ago. I braced myself, not sure what was coming. I owe you an apology. A real one, not just for being difficult about the transition to independence, but for years of taking your sacrifices for granted. I spent so long seeing you only as Mom, as this person whose job it was to solve my problems and support my dreams, that I forgot you were also Eleanor, with your own needs and goals and desires. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. This acknowledgement, this recognition of my humanity beyond my role as her mother, was something I'd never dared to hope for. I think about all those years when you worked extra shifts to support both of us, when you put your own dreams on hold to make sure I had opportunities, when you probably wanted to date or travel or just have time to yourself, but you didn't because you thought I needed you to be completely available. You did need me, I said gently. You were a child and then a teenager. It was my job to prioritize your needs during those years. Yes, But I wasn't a child anymore when I was 25 and still expecting you to prioritize my needs above your own. I wasn't a teenager when I was calling you to rescue me from every difficult situation instead of learning to handle them myself. Charlotte stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the river the way she always did when she was processing difficult emotions. I was angry with you for so long for abandoning me. But you didn't abandon me, Mom. You saved me from abandoning myself. What do you mean? I mean that if you'd kept rescuing me, I never would have learned that I was capable of taking care of myself. I would have spent my whole life being dependent on other people. First you, then probably some unfortunate romantic partner who would eventually get tired of my helplessness. I would never have discovered that I actually like the person I am when I'm strong and capable and independent. She turned back to face me, and her expression was serious but peaceful. The work I'm doing now, with at-risk youth, I'm good at it, Mom. Really good. And I don't think I would have been if I hadn't gone through my own process of learning to stand on my own feet. You're not just good at it, I said. You're passionate about it in a way I've never seen you passionate about anything before. Because it matters. These kids, some of them are so lost, so convinced that they're not worth investing in, and I can tell them from personal experience that sometimes the people who love you most have to let you struggle in order to help you discover your own strength. The parallels between Charlotte's current work and my decision to step back from rescuing her weren't lost on either of us. She'd found her calling in helping others navigate the same journey toward independence that she'd been forced to take herself. I want to take this job, she said decisively. The training will be challenging and the work won't always be easy, but I think this is what I'm meant to be doing. Then you should take it. Just like that? You're not going to analyze all the potential problems or make me create a detailed plan for how I'll handle the additional responsibilities? I laughed. Charlotte, you're 25 years old with 6 months of successful independence under your belt. If you can't analyze the potential problems and create your own plans by now, then I've failed as a mother. You haven't failed, she said quickly. You succeeded. It just took me a while to recognize it. We spent the next hour preparing lunch together, but the dynamic felt different from our usual Sunday routine. There was something lighter in Charlotte's movements, more confident in the way she moved around my kitchen. She wasn't just my daughter visiting for our weekly meal. She was a successful adult woman sharing her life with someone she genuinely wanted to spend time with. Can I ask you something? She said as we sat down to eat. Of course. Are you happy? I mean, really happy, not just making the best of things happy. The question caught me off guard. Why do you ask? Because I realized recently that I've spent most of my life so focused on my own problems that I never really thought about whether you were happy. I just assumed that taking care of me was what made you happy, that being needed was the same thing as being fulfilled. I considered her question seriously. Was I happy? The woman I'd been a year ago, exhausted, resentful, slowly disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs, that woman had barely remembered what happiness felt like. But this woman, sitting in her own apartment with her daughter who had become a genuine friend, in a relationship built on mutual respect rather than desperate need, doing work that challenged and fulfilled her, was she happy? Yes, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. I'm happier than I've ever been in my adult life. Good, Charlotte said firmly. You deserve that. After lunch, David arrived as we'd planned. I watched nervously as he greeted Charlotte, still not entirely sure how their relationship would evolve. Over the past months, they'd been cordial but cautious with each other, both of them wanting to respect my relationship with the other, but neither quite sure how to navigate the complexity of the situation. But today felt different. Charlotte stood up when David entered, and instead of the polite but distant hug she usually offered, she embraced him with genuine warmth. David, I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. He looked surprised but pleased. For what? For being awful to you when we first met. You were trying to be supportive and helpful, and I was so angry about Mom's new boundaries that I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. David's smile was gentle and understanding. You were going through a difficult transition. I didn't take it personally. Maybe you should have, Charlotte said. I was being personally awful to you. But I want you to know that I see now how good you are for Mom, and how much happier she is with you in her life. I'm grateful for that. I watched this exchange with amazement. The daughter who had once seen David as competition for my attention was now thanking him for contributing to my happiness. It was perhaps the clearest sign of how much she'd matured. We spent the afternoon together, all three of us, talking about Charlotte's job opportunity, David's plans for expanding the rare book section of his store, my recent promotion, and the new challenges it brought. It felt like a family dinner, but a healthy version of family that I'd never experienced before. Instead of relationships based on need and obligation, we were three adults who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and wanted to support each other's individual growth. As the sun began to set, Charlotte prepared to leave for her evening shift at a local restaurant where she'd picked up part-time work to supplement her nonprofit income. She'd been working 2 jobs for 3 months now, saving money for the car she planned to buy once her bicycle commuting became impractical in winter. The old Charlotte would have expected me to help her buy the car. This Charlotte was proud of earning it herself. "Mom," she said as she gathered her things, "I need to ask you something else." "What's that?" "The Hendersons, the family renting the cabin, how are they doing?" I was surprised by the question. Charlotte rarely mentioned the mountain house anymore, and when she did, it was usually with embarrassment about her initial assumptions. "They're doing well. Jenny just had their 3rd baby, and Mark's construction business is thriving. They love the mountain location." "Good." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I drove by there last week just to see it again. They've fixed up the garden, and there were children's toys on the porch, and it looked alive. More alive than it would have looked with just me living there." "What made you drive by?" "I wanted to see if I was still angry about it. If I still felt like you'd cheated me out of something that should have been mine." She smiled, but all I felt was grateful. Grateful that you cared enough about my future to trick me into having one. As Charlotte left that evening, she hugged me tightly. Not the desperate clinging of someone afraid to be alone, but the warm embrace of someone who was secure in her relationships because she was secure in herself. "I love you, Mom," she said. "Thank you for saving my life by refusing to rescue me from it." After she left, David and I cleaned up together, moving around each other in the easy rhythm we'd developed over months of shared domesticity. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the conversation we'd had a few weeks earlier about finding a larger place together. "She's remarkable," David said, drying the dishes I'd washed. "The change in her over these months, it's been incredible to watch. She's become the woman I always hoped she could be," I agreed. "But I'm not sure I ever really believed she'd get there." "What changed your mind?" I considered the question. I think I had to learn to see her as capable of change before she could see it herself. As long as I kept treating her like someone who needed to be rescued, she kept acting like someone who needed to be rescued. And now? Now she's treating herself like someone worth investing in, someone with something valuable to offer the world. That evening, after David had gone to his own apartment to collect some books he wanted to show me, I sat alone on my small balcony with a cup of tea, watching the lights of Asheville twinkle in the valley below. The air was warm for March, carrying the promise of spring and new beginnings. In a few weeks, the mountains would explode in shades of green, and the city would come alive with tourists and festivals and the energy of renewal. I thought about the woman I'd been exactly 1 year ago. Exhausted, resentful, slowly disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs. That woman had been so afraid of disappointing Charlotte that she'd been willing to disappoint herself indefinitely. She'd believed that maternal love meant endless sacrifice, that setting boundaries was selfish, that her own happiness was somehow less important than her daughter's comfort. I thought about Charlotte too, the angry, entitled young woman who'd arrived at my apartment 6 months ago, expecting me to solve her problems and arrange my life around her needs. That version of my daughter had been trapped by her own dependence, unable to develop the skills and confidence she needed to build a meaningful life. Both of those women were gone now, replaced by people who were still learning and growing, but who finally understood the difference between love and enabling. The process had been painful. There had been tears, arguments, long stretches of silence, and moments when I doubted everything. But we'd emerged on the other side with something stronger and more authentic than what we'd had before. My phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Thanks for today. Taking the job. Excited and terrified, but mostly excited. Love you." I typed back, "So proud of you. You're going to be amazing at this." A few minutes later, another text arrived. "Also, you and David should definitely get that bigger apartment. Time to stop pretending you're not ready for that step." I smiled at the message, at the emoji that represented such a fundamental shift in how Charlotte viewed my relationship with David. A year ago, she would have seen any expansion of my life as a threat to her security. Now she was actively encouraging my happiness. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was struck by what I saw. The woman looking back at me had shorter hair now, silver threading through the brown in a way that looked distinguished rather than merely aging. Her skin had the kind of glow that came from adequate sleep and reduced stress. Her eyes were clear and purposeful. no longer clouded by the constant anxiety that had defined her previous existence. But more than the physical changes, there was something in her expression that was entirely new. A sense of ownership over her own life. A confidence that came from making difficult choices and surviving their consequences. This was a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment, to value her own needs, to believe in her own worth. I climbed into bed in my small apartment, listening to the familiar sound of the river flowing past in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Charlotte's career transition, my increasing responsibilities at work, David's and my decision about moving in together permanently. But I would face these challenges as Eleanor, not as an extension of someone else's needs. I would face them with David beside me, with Charlotte as a true partner rather than a dependent, with friends I'd made through pottery classes and book clubs and volunteer work at the hospital. 6 months ago, I'd been terrified that choosing my own happiness might destroy my relationship with my daughter. Instead, it had saved that relationship by transforming it into something based on mutual respect rather than codependent need. Charlotte had become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with, not just someone I felt obligated to rescue. And I had become someone worthy of her respect and admiration, not just her resentment and demands. The mountains held their ancient silence around Asheville, and I held my newfound peace just as quietly, just as surely. Tomorrow, Charlotte would wake up in her own apartment, ready to take on new responsibilities and challenges with confidence born from genuine achievement. Tomorrow, David would open his bookstore and continue the patient work of building a relationship with someone who had finally learned the difference between being needed and being loved. And tomorrow, I would wake up as Eleanor, not just Charlotte's mother or the reliable nurse or the woman who always said yes to everyone else's needs, but as myself, fully realized and finally free. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, periods of loneliness, times when the old patterns had seemed so much simpler than the messy work of authentic relationship. But lying in my own bed, in my own space, surrounded by evidence of my own choices and accomplishments, I knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment had been worth it. I'd finally learned that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. It was fear dressed up as devotion. Real love, the kind that actually helped people grow and thrive, required the courage to disappoint people temporarily in service of their long-term well-being. It required trusting them enough to believe they could handle disappointment and grow from it. In the distance, an owl called from somewhere in the mountains, its voice carrying across the sleeping city like a benediction. I smiled in the darkness and pulled my covers up around my shoulders, completely at home in the life I'd finally learned to claim as my own. The river continued its ancient flow outside my window, carrying the past away and bringing new possibilities with each passing moment. I drifted off to sleep with Charlotte's words echoing in my mind. Thank you for saving my life by refusing to rescue me from it. It had taken me 52 years to learn that the most loving thing you could sometimes do was refuse to be endlessly helpful. But now that I'd learned it, now that I'd lived it and survived it, and seen its fruits in my daughter's transformation and my own, I knew I would never go back to the old way of loving. Outside, the mountains stood eternal in their silence, witnesses to another small story of growth and change and the courage it takes to love someone enough to let them become who they're meant to be. And inside my small apartment, I slept the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who had finally learned to trust both herself and the people she loved most. I had just bought my chalet when my daughter called saying, "I'm going to live there now, keep my room tidy and bring me food." I just smiled. The day she arrived, she called me desperately when she saw another person living there,